The Maybe Ghost, Orwell River, Prince Edward Island. James Hayden Fletcher didn't believe in ghosts. As a young boy growing up in a small community at the mouth of the Orwell River, about 25 kilometers east of Charlottetown, PEI, he and his siblings loved hearing the spooky stories that workers at his father's sawmill would tell as they sat around the fireplace at the end of the day. The stories filled them all with a delicious mix of excitement and fear. When he grew up, Fletcher was a little disappointed, but very relieved to find out that most of those tales were grounded not in facts, but in Irish and Scottish superstitions, and he stopped believing in ghosts. He even went so far as to try to convince friends and neighbors who did that they were foolish to do so. Still, in an article titled The Ghost Story, published in the Prince Edward Island magazine in 1900, when he was about 60, Fletcher admitted that those scary stories still had an impact on him as a non-believing adult. He confessed that whenever I got into a suspicious place after dark, I always looked over my shoulder to make sure that no unnatural visitor was crawling on me from behind. So it didn't come as a surprise that, as a young man, he started feeling very nervous walking home from the blacksmith's shop after dark one night, especially when he realized he would have to pass by an old graveyard. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but when he came to the cemetery gate, he couldn't resist turning toward it. He immediately wished he hadn't. Decades later, Fletcher still remembered vividly that he saw what he saw that night, a mysterious tall white figure. In the Ghost Story article, he wrote about how he felt at that moment. In spite of my philosophy, I felt my hat rise from my head. I looked out into the darkness again and saw it move. There was no mistake about it. The specter continued to move. It slowly began to advance toward me. It gradually appeared to grow taller and whiter. Fletcher was terrified, but he decided not to run, just in case the ghostly figure was the spirit of a close friend who wanted to communicate with him. A strange thought for someone who didn't believe in ghosts. Instead, he decided to speak to it. "How do you do?" he asked, and was incredibly relieved to hear a human voice answer. "Well, thank the Lord," Fletcher recalled. "It was the most welcome sound I ever heard, and yet I became so weak I could scarcely walk." But walk Fletcher did as soon as he could, not lingering to chat with the robed figure, whom he thought he recognized as an old fellow from New Perth known as Crazy Donald Gordon. Gordon had apparently become mentally ill in his old age and had started wearing strange robes and performing bizarre religious rituals. Fletcher assumed Gordon had been saying prayers for the dead in the graveyard. Nevertheless, he readily admitted that nothing he had ever seen in his whole life ever frightened him so badly as the appearance of the white-robed man in the cemetery. But could Fletcher's first impression that a ghost was moving toward him have been correct? After all, he did mention in his article that Gordon has scarcely ever been seen before the Vin City or of Orwell. He also referred to the man as a patriarch, the head of a large family. A few old records point to the possibility that one Donald Gordon, who fathered many children, may have already been dead when Fletcher walked past the graveyard. Of course, records can be incorrect or incomplete, but maybe they weren't. Maybe Fletcher, the man who didn't believe in ghosts, had a very good reason to be afraid that night. Girl in the Water, Payne Court, Ontario. Payne Court is a village located on the Thames River near Chatham, Ontario. It was settled in the late 1700s by poor immigrants from the Detroit area of Michigan who moved onto native lands there. By the 1820s, it had become one of the earliest French-speaking communities in southern Ontario. The village's historical significance is highlighted on a plaque put up by the Ontario Heritage Foundation in front of Payne's Court Church of the Immaculate Conception. What the plaque doesn't say is that the area is reported to have been haunted for the last 100 or so years by a ghost. It's thought that this restless soul is the spirit of Mary Jacobs, a young woman who had fallen for a man named Alex Miller. Her parents weren't impressed with this young man. In fact, they were furious that their daughter was seeing him. But Mary was in love with Alex, and according to her parents, after a big argument with them, she ran off with him. Some days later, she turned up dead. According to the one vision of the story, Mary's putrid body was found partially buried behind the barn on the family farm, showing signs of death by foul play. Another story claims it was first hidden on the property and then thrown into the Thames, where it was found floating downstream. Even though the body bore marks of a severe beating, local authorities decided Mary had committed suicide by drowning herself. Publicly, Mary's parents blamed Alex for her death, but privately they knew that the heat had nothing to do with it. Apparently, during the fight with their daughter over her choice of boyfriend, Mrs. Jacobs had flown into a rage and had beaten her daughter to death with a heavy iron. Then the couple had tried to cover up the crime, and since Mary's death was ruled a suicide, it looks as if officially they succeeded. Over the years, the phantom presence of a young woman has been seen at different places along the river near the spot where Mary's body was found. There was even one report years ago of a young minister, a Reverend Knight, being scared out of his wits when he saw a woman's body floating in the river, only to have the vision suddenly disappear. Some local residents say it's Mary who haunts the Thames around Payne Court, looking for the man she fell in love with, but maybe her spirit can't find peace because of the terrible way she died at the hands of her own mother. The Phantom Steamship, Lake Superior, Ontario. For at least 200 years, sailors worldwide have shared tales of seeing a ship called the Flying Dutchman, but they haven't all been talking about the same vessel. The original Flying Dutchman was probably a ship captained by a Dutchman named Hendrik van der Decken more than 350 years ago. The ship never made it back to its home port of Amsterdam, Holland, and it was generally believed that it sank during a storm in the dangerous waters around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. But time and time again, long after Van der Decken's ship was lost, captains of other sailing ships reported seeing the doomed vessel and its ghostly crew. In some cases, they even got close enough to the Dutchman's ship to hear him ask them to take some letters home. It was rumored that any ship agreeing to take those letters from Van der Decken would also be swallowed up by the stormy seas, and so the legend of the Flying Dutchman was born, and lives on to this day. Over time, the Flying Dutchman tag came to mean any ghost ship fated to sail for all eternity the waters where it sank, and many different Flying Dutchmen are said to sail the world's seas and oceans. The mysterious fate of the steamship Bannockburn was earned it the spooky reputation of being the Flying Dutchman of Canada's largest, coldest, and deepest Great Lake, Lake Superior. The Bannockburn was sturdy all-steel steamer built in England in 1893 for the Montreal Transportation Company. At 74.7 meters, it was designed specifically to be just under the length restriction at the time for ships navigating the Great Lakes waterway. Any longer, and they couldn't fit easily in the locks of the Welland Canal, which connects Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. On November 20th, 1902, the Bannockburn finished taking on a full load of wheat at Port Arthur, Ontario, known as Thunder Bay. It was to deliver the wheat to the port at the Midland, Ontario, on Lake Huron's Georgian Bay. Early the next morning, it left Port Arthur and made for the open waters of Lake Superior. By late afternoon, despite a strong headwind, it was already nearly 100 kilometers southeast of Passage Island. James McCaw, captain of the Algonquin, a steamer sailed toward Port Arthur, spotted the Bannockburn and kept an eye on its progress for several minutes. At one point, though, he turned away briefly to deal with something that required his attention, and when he looked back a minute or two later, he was surprised to find that he could no longer see the Bannockburn. It was as if it had suddenly disappeared. Assuming the steamer had been hidden behind a distant bank of fog, Mi'kmaq sailed on, not worrying about what had happened until he heard later that the Bannockburn hadn't stopped at Sault Ste. Marie as planned. In fact, after Mi'kmaq's sighting, the Bannockburn was never seen again. The waters of Lake Superior can be dangerous. Powerful storms often build up without warning, especially in the cold, wind-plagued month of November. After days of searching without success for the Bannockburn, everyone concluded that a deadly Lake Superior storm had claimed yet another ship and 22 more victims, the crew aboard the Bannockburn. Starting in 1903, the sailors on watch duty began to report seeing the Bannockburn, its running lights still working, churning through choppy waters towards Sault Ste. Marie. Other reports described the ship as being covered with ice, a ghostly white apparition sailing off into the darkness, and a few seamen even spoke in hushed tones of how they had seen skeleton-like crewmen with hollow eyes manning the ghost ship as it sailed silently by. What happened to the Bannockburn, why it sank without warning, and where is still a mystery, but it's not hard to see why the steamer has come to be known as the Flying Dutchman of Lake Superior, doomed to sail that Great Lakes waters for all eternity. The Ship That Wouldn't Die, Arctic Ocean. Another sturdy steel cargo steamer, the Bachimo, also came to be known as a ghost ship, but not because it sank without a trace with all hands on board, only to reappear months or years later. In a way, the Bachimo's fate was the exact opposite of the Bannockburn's in that it seemed to be unsinkable and ended up being dubbed the Ship That Wouldn't Die. In 1969, a group of Inuit hunters reported seeing the Bachimo adrift the Cherokee Sea, just west of Point Barrow, the northernmost tip of Alaska. Until then, everyone who knew about the cargo ship had assumed it had finally sunk. After all, the last time anyone had seen it was 7 years before, in 1962, when some Inuit kayakers spotted it in the icy waters of the Beaufort Sea. But people's assumptions about the fate of the Bachimo have been proven wrong before. So the fact that it was seen again didn't come as such a great surprise. That was and still is truly amazing in the fact that Bachimo first disappeared way back in 1931. The 70-meter-long cargo ship had been built in Sweden in 1914. In 1919, the Hudson Bay Company bought it and had refitted it. It had to be able to withstand the hazards it would encounter sailing the treacherous waters of the Atlantic Ocean. In 1921, it was sent to the eastern Arctic to visit various HPC outposts on Baffin Island, where Inuit hunters came to trade furs in exchange for food and other essential supplies. In 1925, it was assigned to do the same thing along the western Arctic shores. In early July of 1931, with Captain John Cornwell at the helm and a crew of 66 on board, the Bachimo set sail from Vancouver on its regular annual trading run up the west coast of British Columbia and around Alaska and through the Beaufort Sea to Victoria Island in the Arctic. But this trip would prove to be anything but regular. The outward-bound portion of the journey was going well, and the Bachimo's hold was carrying nearly a full load of furs and skins when Captain Cornwell decided to cut short the trip after reaching Coppermine, now Kugluktuk, on September 5th. He was worried because he was encountering more large ice floes than he expected to see at the time of the year. His fears were not unfounded. Disaster struck on the return voyage. That September, winter came early to the Arctic. On October 9th, the ship found itself trapped in ice about 1.5 kilometers from shore near Barrow, Alaska. Via the ship's radio, Captain Cornwall arranged for planes to pick up half the men as soon as weather permitted. Then he and 16 remaining crew members began preparations to spend the winter with the steamer and its valuable cargo. The plan was to build a hut on shore, stocking it with supplies they hauled over the ice from the ship. They were also to store on shore as many of the fur bales as they could manage to move, and everything went according to plan at first. All of the crew had moved into the large shack by the end of October, and they were getting by fairly well, despite crowded conditions and the depressing lack of daylight at that time of year. The shack was actually warmer than the ship, but on November 24th, gale-force winds and blinding snow began battering the shelter, and the men were forced to stay indoors for 2 days. On the morning of the 26th, when the storm had died down a little, they emerged from the hut to be greeted by an amazing sight. Snow and ice piles nearly 6 meters high had built up where the Bachimo had been trapped, and the ship was nowhere to be seen. Had the steamer been pushed underwater by that massive mountain of ice and snow? That's what most of the men thought, and the captain radioed HBC headquarters with the bad news. But on December 3rd, Captain Cornwall received a message that shocked everyone. The Bachimo had been sighted about 80 kilometers north of their location, trapped in ice about 8 kilometers offshore. A small group of Inuit and white trappers made several trips to the ship, taking away most things of value, including the remaining bales of fur. Those men reported that the steamer had a hole in its side and would most likely sink as soon as the ice broke up. Clearly, then, there was no longer any reason for Captain Cornwall and his crew to spend the winter in their makeshift accommodations, and planes were finally able to reach them during the second week of February of 1932. They were all greatly relieved that the last voyage of the Bachimo had finally come to an end, and everyone returning home safely. But while the voyage may have ended for the crew, it was far more over the ship. It was almost as if, once freed from the control of human hands, the Bachimo had taken on a life of its own. Against all odds, it survived the next thaw and many others afterward, and continued to sail the waters of the western Arctic. It was seen 3 times over the next 2 years, and again in 1935 and 1939. After World War II, researchers and explorers joined the Inuit kayakers and dog sledders in reporting that they had seen the ship that wouldn't die, looking over more rusty and battered as time passed. It has still managed to survive decades of brutal Arctic winters and to continue its mysterious voyage to some unknown destination, dodging deadly icebergs along the way. It's been nearly 40 years since the Inuit hunters reported seeing the Bachimo afloat back in 1969. Surely it must have sunk by now, but who knows? People have believed that many times before and over, the sturdy steel steamer proved them wrong. Maybe it really is a ship that will never die. The Invisible Beast, Moser River, Nova Scotia. Moser River is a small village on Nova Scotia's coastal highway 7, just west of the Halifax-Guysborough County line. The village takes its name from the river on which it was built, and both were named after Henry Moser. He bought land and settled in the area in the late 1700s. Life in Moser River during the first half of the 20th century was still pretty much as quiet and slow-paced as it had been for Moser's children and grandchildren. People made a living fishing, farming, and working in the lumber business. Spending time with the neighbors singing, playing the fiddle, step dancing, or playing cards was a pleasant break from the demands of work and daily chores. Back in the early 1900s, Bob Lowe, a Moser River resident, had just spent an enjoyable evening like the night he got the Back in the early 1900s, Bob Lowe, a Moser River resident, had just spent an enjoyable evening like that the night he got the first fright of his life. It was raining when he left his neighbor's house, so he pulled up his coat collar and set out along the road toward home. Suddenly, out of nowhere, he heard a scrambling noise in the bushes. Then something unseen rammed into him, pulling off his coat and knocking him down as it raced past. Lowe picked himself up, reached down for his muddy coat, and, after a quick look around, he ran home as fast as his trembling legs would take him. But even though he was scared, he was also curious about what had happened, so when he calmed down and he went back out to the road, armed with a rifle and a lantern, when he reached the spot where he had been attacked, he carefully examined the muddy ground and nearby bushes along the roadside. But try as he might, he couldn't find a single trace of who or what had struck him. All he could see were his own footprints. Then he heard the noise again. This time Lowe could make out the sounds of a four-footed creature moving quickly toward him, but once again he could see nothing. He shouted into the darkness, hoping to scare off the invisible beast, but it kept coming. Once again Lowe started running as fast as he could. The phantom pursued him relentlessly until he neared home. Then his sound suddenly faded into the darkness, leaving behind no evidence at all of its horrifying presence. But traces of the spooky run-in on the road near Moser River would remain burned in Lowe's memory until the day he died.